This is a trip on civil rights, American civil rights, that happened in this country, in the South, from the years 1955 to 1968.
Sometimes the best way to make history come alive is to take your students to the places where things happened.
I was 3 years old. My mom died in the halls of a hospital in Selma, a white hospital, because they refused to treat her.
I had heard about the 8th grade civil rights trip for a few years before I reached out to Catherine Sanford, the teacher who organized the trip. I thought if I interviewed her, it could help raise awareness and assist them with their fundraising. Little did I know that it would take me on my own Southern Civil Rights trip, along with these intrepid 8th graders.
I'm the teacher who organizes it. I started doing it because I had realized that many students in West Marin, which was, a planned all-white community, didn't really understand some of the struggles that people of color had. It was really hard for me, even with video and so many audio recordings from that time, to make the history come alive. Many people in our community will never have the opportunity to meet, or places they'll never have the opportunity to go. And so if you go on the trip, it's both a responsibility to help make it happen and then to come back and share what you've learned.
In November, I got a chance to speak to Eben, who had gone on the first trip post-pandemic.
It was a really sort of transformative experience because we've been learning about the civil rights movement the whole year. And then sort of going to the place that everything happened and meeting these people, it sort of gave like a purpose to all the learning, all the reading, and it just really sort of infused all that with like a purpose. And it really helped me sort of feel like the weight of all that happened, which allows you to see sort of the true courage of like the leaders who were involved. Like I have a much better understanding of that time in history.
Catherine Sanford learned about Billy Planer, who runs Edgar 36, the tour company, from some friends, and approached him to set up the trip.
I got a phone call from a youth director from Santa Cruz, California, telling me that she was bringing her youth group on a trip to the American South about civil rights. And her friend told her that I just ran this trip that had the first 3 or 4 days was about civil rights. And could I talk to her about how to get in and out of Alabama, basically is what she asked. And as I was talking her through it, she just said, could I hire you to run the trip? And that was in 2003. And it's been 20 years of running these civil rights journeys as well as the summer trip.
Edgar 36 is just one of many companies that lead these types of civil rights trips in the South. Before I left, I checked in with Marin County Superintendent of Schools, John Carroll. John had served as a superintendent of Lagunitas School District, and John had given Catherine Sanford the go-ahead for her civil rights trip.
My wife, Monique Paltrineri, and my daughter, Casey Carroll, drove back across the country taking the southern route. And they went to a lot of like famous civil rights sites and saw various memorials. And later that year, when we got back, Monique was having a chat with Catherine, and kind of at the same time, there was this like, wouldn't it be great if the students in Lagunitas could have a similar experience to what the two of them had sort of, without a whole lot of planning, kind of come across. And then Catherine sort of went from there and like fleshed out a plan for what that might look like, sort of as an alternative to the traditional, let's go to Washington, D.C. or New York field trip that's so common. So then she came up with this plan and brought it to me. I was 100% behind it.
I pushed Superintendent Carroll about whether this kind of trip could be scaled to other schools in Marin County. Here is what he shared.
I think it's one of the maybe the most valuable learning experience that I've seen at Lagunitas in the middle school. I might be selling someone else short. There are other great programs too there, but that one really stands out as something that changes students' attitudes and beliefs before they go off to high school. I think there's some challenges around bringing it to scale. When you have Lagunitas is they're small, so they're pretty nimble, and they have a pretty high risk tolerance. And they back then, and I think they still do, they have superintendents and principals who are willing to go out on a limb, and a community that's supportive of that. So there are a lot of pieces that Lagunitas has pretty well set up in advance. So I would highly encourage it. One thing it takes, obviously, is somebody like Catherine Sanford. Without a strong champion to move that project forward, I think it would be much more difficult.
In April, after sending in my funding for the trip, I visited some friends in North Carolina before joining the group in Atlanta, Georgia. I met the students, parents, the chaperones, the teacher at the Atlanta airport as they piled off the plane laden with backpacks. I joined them and we made our way through the big Atlanta airport to baggage claim, where we met our guide, Scott Freed.
Welcome to Atlanta, where I'm told, because I'm from New York, we don't say Atlanta, we say Atlanta. Let me hear you say that. Atlanta. You guys are already ahead. That's great. The most important thing I have to tell you is the name of your bus driver. Everybody say, "Hi, Tony." Hi, Tony. Tony's going to stay with us and keep us safe until Thursday when we get right back to this very spot. We'll take you there back to your plane. We're going to go over to the King Center, Dr. King's house where he was born, and then the tomb where he's buried. And we'll spend a little bit of time there. I want to give you some rules to start off with. But since we're on a trip that's about civil rights, the most important thing I can say is that civil rights didn't just happen and didn't get just fought for in the 13 years from Rosa Parks getting arrested in 1955 to Dr. King being assassinated in 1968. Civil rights is still alive and well, not so well, but it's very much alive today in America, in the ways in which we treat each other as Americans, in the ways in which we vote or are not allowed to vote, voter suppression, in the ways in which we consider people who are of marginalized communities, Black, Indigent, Latino, LGBTQ+, etc. So civil rights is still an issue that we're dealing with very much so today.
I'm not going to lie, we were all pretty tired from traveling. At the King Center for Nonviolent Change, the slightly dazed and exhausted group trailed Scott as we checked out Dr. King's birth home and then headed towards the reflecting pool where Dr. and Mrs. King's grave is located on a platform. Before getting a National Park Service-led tour of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, the students spent some time learning about Dr. King's principles of nonviolence.
Nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. The end result of nonviolence is redemption and reconciliation. The purpose of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community.
Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. Nonviolence recognizes that evildoers are also victims and are not evil people. The nonviolent resistor seeks to defeat evil, not people.
Nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform people and societies. Nonviolence accepts suffering without retaliation. Unlearned suffering is redemptive and has tremendous educational and transforming possibilities.
Nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. Nonviolence resists violence of the spirit as well as the body. Nonviolence love is spontaneous, unmotivated, unselfish, and creative.
Folks were re-energized by the incredible food court that we went to and visited for dinner. There were many options throughout the trip for really good food, including some down-home Southern food. And the kids were all set free to find their desired dinner and hang with their classmates. The trip was only 4 days total, and we packed a lot in. On day 2, we had an early start, and we boarded the bus, where the kids always greeted the bus driver and thanked him.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
Okay.
Hi, Tony. Thank you. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Tony. Hi, Tony. Thank you. Hi, Tony.
We headed to Montgomery, Alabama, where our first stop was at the Rosa Parks Museum. The museum opened in December of 2000, and Rosa Parks and her family were the first to tour the exhibits. The museum is located at the location of her arrest when she refused to give up her seat on the bus. We learned about the boycott and how people creatively banded together to give one another rides to church, in quotes, or so they said. Folks did a lot of walking to make their point. After lunch in the park, Across the street, we boarded the bus and headed to Selma, Alabama. On the bus, we were able to look out across the southern landscape, the farmland and the small towns that we passed. In Selma, we drove across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, hung a right on one of the few city streets, and were dropped off to visit Joanne Bland. Joanne grew up in Selma and was a co-founder of the National Voting Rights Museum. She has since retired and now runs Journey for the Soul tours. Billy Planer from Edgar 36 has worked with Joanne for many years.
Joanne and I have a long history together. She was the executive director of the National Voting Rights Museum, and part of the tour was her telling her story. She was 11 years old when she was beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday, and she was transitioning on from being the executive director. And when she was telling me that, I just said to her, what if we do this outside of the museum? Because the museums too are important, and it's powerful to be in these museums, in these spots. But to me, even more powerful is the personal narrative.
Joanne invited us into her museum shop where she spoke to the students and chaperones. I did not record Joanne there, but found some similar audio of her story on the Public Radio Exchange. I would like to thank our radio colleagues at KQEL in Winona, Minnesota.
My grandmother, Sylvia Johnson, came to live with us when I was 3 years old. My mom died in the halls of a hospital in Selma, a white hospital, because they refused to treat her. She left 4 little kids. I was the second youngest. I was 3 years old. My grandmother came from Detroit, and she couldn't understand, after being gone for over 40 years, how things had not changed in the South since she had left. We still had segregation. We still had signs that said, no Negroes allowed, colored seated in the rear, whites only, colored bathroom, white bathroom. She said, that's not right. We also had no representation in the political arena. My 3rd grade teacher, Miss Boyd, had told me that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Obviously, these adults didn't know it. I felt smug in my belief that I was the smartest person in that room. One day, my grandmother was downtown, what we call downtown. It's just one little street, about 6 little blocks of stores. Okay, I live in a small town. We were standing in front of Carter's drugstore. Carter's had a lunch counter. Every time I pass by Carter's or go in Carter's, I see the white kids sitting at the lunch counter, licking on an ice cream cone, drinking a milkshake from this tall, beautiful glass. And I wanted to do that. Grandmother said I couldn't. I said, why, Grandma? She said, because you're colored. Colored children cannot sit at the counter. Didn't stop me from wanting to sit at that counter. Every time I pass by there, I'd be looking in that mirror, in that window, trying to see, watching those white kids, wishing it was me. Well, one day, we were standing in front of the store, and my grandmother noticed me peeping in the window, and she leaned over my shoulder, and she said, when we get our freedom, you can do that too. I became a freedom fighter that day.
I don't think there was a dry eye in the house after meeting Joanne and hearing her story. The bus then made a quick loop around the small city of Selma, where we got a chance to see a park that Joanne Bland is helping to fund and see recent evidence of tornado damage from some epic storms.
It was really cool to see someone and talk to someone who was on the bridge on the day of Bloody Sunday and talk about it. And I just made it feel a lot different than it is just on the textbooks.
It was really incredible to speak to somebody firsthand who experienced that and was there on that day.
Then we walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
This is where it all happened. I don't know, there was like a couple thousand people here, all marching in the same exact area. It's just, it's crazy seeing this place and knowing that there was but even that side all the buildings still look like the same, just a little bit more run down.
Yep. And now I'm like picturing where all like the reporters were lined up and all the policemen and everyone. And just how scary it must have been to be just walking down nonstop and then having to run back.
Back on the bus, and we drove the exact route that the marchers walked from Selma to Montgomery. When we got to the hotel, there was pizza and some swimming for the students. Day 3 started in Montgomery.
We go to the Legacy Museum and the Peace and Justice Memorial, both started by Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative, with the intention of putting history into context.
The Legacy Museum is a project of the Equal Justice Initiative, and it opened in 2018. It is 11,000 square feet of interactive exhibits, a world-class art gallery, and an amazing bookstore. The museum is located near the site of one of the most prominent slave auctions. The museum is immersive, utilizing audio, video, text, and holograms. We were given 2 hours. Nobody got to see everything. We then drove on the bus directly to the Memorial for Peace and Justice. This is also a project of the Equal Justice Initiative and also opened in 2018. It sits on a 6-acre site and houses 800 6-foot monuments documenting over 4,400 lynching incidents between 1877 and 1950.
What stood out for me at the trip was probably the Legacy Museum. The Legacy Museum was very moving for me, and I got very emotional because it just showed all of the stages of first like slavery, kidnapping and separating families to our current state of racism. And it kind of shows me how how racism has evolved and changed in a way where it can be more slighter, and like no one can probably catch it unless they really pay attention to it.
On a trip like this, you gotta eat, so it was time for some real Southern cooking. The bus pulled up to an unassuming building that housed Martha's Place, a buffet-style restaurant that had it all: fried okra, chicken, grits, salad, and sweet tea. Martha pulled herself up from her bootstraps and began this restaurant, employing others who came from the prison systems and other hard luck stories. The food was delicious. Back on the bus and off to Birmingham, Alabama.
We also go to the 16th Street Baptist Church where the bombing was, and there's a park outside with all these monuments, and we meet a bishop who was part of Martin Luther King's inner circle, and he's unlike anybody that any of us have ever met, and fires up the kids and tells them all kinds of stories and gets them singing songs and takes them through the park.
Kelly Ingram, Freedom Park. Kelly Ingram was the first American sailor to be killed in World War I. The park was a place for assembly for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and sits catty-corner from the 16th Street Baptist Church, where in 1963 there was a tragic bombing that killed 4 young girls: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair, and Carol Robertson. Birmingham was a hotbed of civil rights activities. I wish we could have spent more time there. It seemed like a thriving city. Bishop Calvin Woods met us in the park for some singing and preaching.
Walking up the freedom lane. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking. Marching up the freedom line. Ain't gonna let the police turn me around, oh, turn me around, oh, turn me around. Ain't gonna let the police turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up the freedom line. I'm gonna walk the walk, come on. Walk the walk, I'm gonna walk the walk, I'm gonna walk the walk, I'm gonna talk the talk, I'm gonna talk the talk, I'm gonna talk the talk. Ain't gonna let nobody nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, I'm marching up the freedom.
We grabbed some dinner at another amazing and well-appointed food court, and then it was a long drive back to Georgia from Alabama, where we would get ready for our final day together. While preparing for this trip, I had the opportunity to speak with Evan Osnos, a journalist now writing for The New Yorker, who happens to be Catherine Sanford's brother. He assisted with some of the fundraising efforts for the trip.
One of the things that's so interesting and cool about that trip is that one of the things we've learned is that in this day and age, I mean, so many of us have been all cooped up we've all been cooped up in some form or another in the last 2 or 3 years. And it's kind of driven home for us just how powerful it can be to actually go out to a new place, see something up close, go to a fantastic museum. I mean, to see objects or to meet people who've actually lived through things that just has this kind of just extraordinary catalytic power to make us experience an emotion that we simply will never be able to get, as brilliant as our phones and our computers really can be. And I think so, you're going to be there, you're going to be hearing things, people's reactions to what it's like being on the ground. I always like to point out my big sister. She will always be my big sister.
It is no small feat to pull together a trip such as this, but I wish that I had been granted this opportunity as a young person, and I felt very fortunate to have the opportunity to go on this trip with this 8th grade class. Our last stop on the trip was the National Human Rights Museum in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. This museum really summed up the whole trip and put human rights into a global perspective. The whole downstairs was really a summary of what we had experienced in our 3 days on the tour, complete with an interactive lunch counter that put the folks seated in a position of people of color being harassed for sitting where they were not welcome. Upstairs, the museum housed exhibits that focused on human rights, atrocities around the globe. It was a lot.
Something that really stuck with me was the museum that we went to, and it had like a table, and then it was like a lunch counter table, and it had a stool, and you sat on the stool, and you put these noise-canceling headphones on, and then you became kind of like as if you were a black person living in like the 1960s or 1950s, and you basically like got like threatened and stuff, and it was a minute and a half long, and you tried to stay calm for as long as you could.
Would I recommend this trip to others? Absolutely. You can build a trip for yourself or get involved and help organize one for your school-age child's group. It takes some doing.
Well, I feel like I just view the movement differently after being able to like meet those people and see what it was like for them. I kind of see it more in their perspective rather than the book's perspectives, because it's very different, and I feel like, I just see the movement a little bit differently now.
It would have been easy to stay in West Marin, read anti-racist books, which I highly recommend, and learn more about the comprehensive history of our country. While not always pretty, is good to understand, lest we continue to repeat ourselves. Billy Planer of Edgar 36 has something to say about this.
That's what's so dangerous about what's happening right now with listen to the phrase we're going to use, the whitewashing of history right now, the sanitizing of history. And by the way, the left needs to be cautious about this as well. If you're going to remove monuments and names that make you uncomfortable, perhaps there's a reason we should be made uncomfortable. And if we keep these here to keep us reminding us of what can be, what can happen, I think as some of the people in Selma will tell you about changing the name of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, be very careful about sanitizing your history. I like the approach of a yes and approach to this. My county, DeKalb County in Atlanta, Georgia, decided that they are not going to take down the Confederate monuments and statues. Instead, they're going to use the money to build other statues and monuments to make sure all the stories are told. Because if you're going to be truthful, the Confederacy is part of our story.
I want to thank Catherine Sanford for her efforts to coordinate this trip, and also to the parents and anyone who attended a civil rights trip fundraiser and helped them raise the money to get these kids going on this trip. You can learn more about how to contribute at leap4education.org, the website where funds are raised for the trip. I have just embarked over the past several years into understanding my own white privilege and my inherent biases. This trip helped me continue to better understand my own place in the world, where I inhabit with so many people who have different experiences than my own. I feel it is my responsibility to keep on learning. Thanks for letting me learn with you, Lagunitas 8th graders.